Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt Camillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Today, we're going to have a virtual tour of Beauport, the Gloucester summer home of Henry Davis Sleeper, one of America's first professional interior designers. We'll learn about the man behind the house, as well as the house itself and its dazzling and eclectic collection of curiosities, colored glass, folk art, and antiquities in every nook and cranny. With over 40 rooms, each with their own unique theme, we'll see why Beauport still fascinates and inspires collectors, designers, and scholars today. Dr. Nora Ellen Carleson is the Curator of Fashion and Decorative Arts at Historic New England, where she helps to steward 38 house museums and a collection of over 125,000 New England artifacts. A historian specializing in fashion, adornment, and design, prior to joining Historic New England, Nora held positions at Winterthur, the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and the Hillwood Estate, among others. Kristen Weiss is the Cape Ann site manager at Historic New England, where her portfolio includes managing Beauport in Gloucester and Cogswell's Grant in Essex. During her 19 years at Historic New England, Kristen has developed multiple tours and lectures on historic sites, landscapes, collectors, and decorative arts. With an undergraduate degree in history and a graduate study program in museums and preservation, Kristen has been working with museum collections and historic houses for almost 30 years. Please join me in welcoming Nora and Kristen.
Thanks so much, Kurt, for introducing us, and thanks to American Ancestors for having us. As Kurt said, I'm Kristen Weiss. I'm the site manager at Beauport. So I manage the visitor experience here. I'm going to be giving you a brief introduction to Henry Davis Sleeper and the property and how it came to Historic New England. And then Nora is going to give you a deeper dive into the rooms and the collections and Beauport's importance in sort of the broader scope of the decorative arts world. So let's jump in. So this is just a little introduction for those of you who are not 100% familiar with historic New England. I just wanted to give you a little sense. Beauport is one of 38 historic properties that are owned and operated by Historic New England, which was originally the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. So some of you might know it better under that name. We're the largest regional preservation organization in the country, founded in 1910 at the height of the colonial revival period, mainly to protect early New England buildings from demolition. And so as a result, you can see this in this sampling, which is not every single house. I just can't fit them all in. But the majority of our house museums date to the 17th and 18th centuries. But of course, Beauport is one of our 3 20th century properties. Beauport is actually Historic New England's most visited property for historic house museum tours. We're open from Memorial Day weekend through mid-October every year. And we have daily museum tours on the half hour. We do monthly landscape tours, and we have a lot of other special programs, such as our bi-monthly Nooks and Crannies tour, which is the big favorite among our constituents. People can come and see every single room in the house. There's about 42 rooms. It takes about 3 hours. Actually, I say 42 rooms, but every single time I try to count, I come up with a different number. So it's just impossible to say. But we also host group tours. We do small outdoor wedding ceremonies, and we have special events such as watching the fireworks over Gloucester Harbor, which you can see in this picture. So just to give you kind of a sense, in 2025, we had about 7,000 visitors during the course of our open season. Now, Beauport was the summer home of Henry Davis Sleeper, who, as Kurt mentioned, was a collector, one of the first professional interior designers in the country. He was born in 1878, youngest of three boys, and he dealt with some respiratory issues throughout his childhood, which put him in and out of the hospital throughout his lifetime. And because of this, he did not have a formal school education, but was tutored at home. There's been some talk about maybe he had studied architecture later in life, but we really have no evidence of that. The family fortune came primarily from Sleeper's grandfather, Jacob Sleeper, who had a real estate business and had basically manufactured uniforms for the Civil War. So that was certainly a substantial fortune. He also was one of the three founders of Boston University. Um, so Sleeper's father died when he was just 13. He lived with his mother, Maria Westcott Sleeper, at various homes in Boston. They also had a shingle-style summer house on the water in Marblehead when he was growing up. You can see this picture is of his rooms at their house on 336 Beacon Street in Boston. You can see he already had a flair as a young man for collecting and arranging objects. A lot of these objects in this picture made their way to Beauport over the years. In fact, the china cabinet that you can see in the background there is right in the front hall when you walk into Beauport for your first room on the tour. Now, Sleeper started his Beauport journey when he met a man named Abram Piatt Andrew. He met him for the first time in 1906 and visited him on Eastern Point at his house, which was called Red Roof. And Sleeper was so delighted with the place, with Andrew, and with the community of writers and artists and bohemians that were out there that he bought land and began building his house within a year of that first visit, just 2 house lots down from Red Roof. Piatt Andrew, as he was known, it was an economics professor at Harvard when he first met Sleeper. Later, he was the director of the Mint and the assistant secretary of the Treasury. He was one of the men who were part of the group who founded the Federal Reserve System. He was also a co-founder of the American Field Service in France during World War I. Eventually, he was elected the congressman for Essex County, for our county here, and for 7 terms. So he was extremely important. If you've ever come into Gloucester, you'll drive over on Route 128 a very big bridge called the A. Piatt Andrew Bridge. So you might have seen his name on the plaque there as you drove by. Now, by all accounts, he was an extremely charismatic person. He attracted followers everywhere he went. Sleeper and Piatt Andrew were both gay men, and Sleeper's personal papers, while they were unfortunately destroyed at his death, his letters to A. Piatt Andrews do survive. They indicate that they were very, very close friends, but we don't have any evidence that they were involved romantically. On Sleeper's side, at least, it does seem that there was a very passionate attachment to him. But that does seem to also be the case for many people because Piatt Andrew was just so magnetic. Plenty of stories of him just being the center of attention wherever he went. The group on Eastern Point that Sleeper found so appealing, not just A. Piatt Andrew, but the whole group of people who lived out there were this wonderful community, colorful people. On the left, the photo you see is a costume party. A. Piatt Andrew is on the left and Henry Sleeper is on the right with the beard. You can see they had a lot of fun out there. They gave the group a name called Dabbsville, and it was created by their initials. So for the D was for a woman named Joanna Davidge, The A was for A. Pied Andrew. The B was for Cecilia Beau, who was a portrait painter. And the S was for Henry Sleeper and for Caroline Sinclair. And also Isabella Stewart Gardner, who you will know, of course, from her beautiful house museum in Boston. She was an honorary member. She didn't own a house on Eastern Point, but she visited all the time. And the photo on the right-hand side here is a gathering at Red Roof around 1910. And in the picture are Okakura Kakuzo, who was the curator of Asian art at the MFA in Boston. He was sort of a protege of Isabella Stewart Gardner, and he was the author of the Book of Tea, which you may know about. It's still very well known and important today. Next to him is Caroline Sinclair and Henry Sleeper, looking kind of quizzical off to the side. And then in the back row is A. Pied Andrew and Isabella Stewart Gardner in this picture. Other friends that were part of this group, but whose initials were not in there, were John Hayes Hammond Jr., who built the Hammond Castle, which is still open to the public today, full of European architectural fragments and amazing pieces collected. That's right across the water from Beauport. Also, actor Leslie Buswell, his Gloucester house was called Stillington Hall. That survives today. It's in private hands, has some amazing sleeper design spaces in it. In this picture, you can see Caroline Sinclair's house is in the center. Between Beauport is to the left, and Pied Andrew's house, Red Roof, is to the right. Caroline Sinclair's house also had a red roof, so she laughingly named her house Wrong Roof. Now, when Sleeper was building Beauport, he engaged Haften Hansen, who pictured here, who's a Norwegian-born architect, but self-taught. He designed and supervised the construction of the building. And over the years, Sleeper and Hansen were just a great match for collaborating. Sleeper would come up with these amazing ideas, and Haften Hansen would put them into action, make them a reality. You can see the plans here are of the completed building. These plans were not actually drawn before. They were drawn in 1935 after Sleeper's death. And it seems clear from this picture, you can see that Haften Hansen's original design was very likely modeled after this picture of a cottage in Hampshire in England. This was in a magazine, in a British magazine called The Studio. It was a prominent magazine, and it featured arts and crafts designs in the winter issue of 1906-07. And Sleeper's construction of Beauport started in 1907, 1908. And so you can see the side of this building is almost exactly the same. The T-shaped windows that face Red Roof. So it's very similar, you can see. During the First World War, just after Sleeper built his house, he spent a lot of time traveling back and forth to Europe to support Pied Andrew in his work with the American Field Service. But he also was, while he was doing this, he was collecting objects and inspiration. He came back with a lot of amazing things from Paris and inserted them in his house. He managed the recruitment for the Field Service in the States, and he raised money at home, and then he would travel back and forth kind of delivering and doing admin, essentially. The book that's featured here in the center, Personal Letters of an Ambulance Driver at the Front, is based on Leslie Buswell's diaries, and that book was sold to raise money in the Boston area. The portrait here, the photograph, is this wonderful group portrait of volunteers for the American Field Service on board ship, ready to head up to Europe on November 11th, 1916. And you can see right in the center there are Pied Andrew to the left and Henry Sleeper to the right there in their sort of bowler hats. Now, as word spread about Henry Sleeper's amazing house, he had all kinds of visitors. He entertained all the time, and he began to be enlisted in commissions to not only to recreate his style, but even sometimes recreate his very rooms from Beauport in other people's homes. And this transformed him into the professional interior designer whose name was so well known that he was featured in this Chase and Sanborn coffee ad from the Saturday Evening Post in March of 1930. He's here with people like Gary Cooper, William Haynes. These are not only famous actors and other men, Richard Halliburton, Alexander Woollcott, but these were all, as you can see, surprisingly domestic bachelors. And each one of these was either rumored to have same sex relationships or even lived openly as gay men. And so it's very interesting, this sort of promotion that happens. He's very well known, he's very well thought of, and yet there's this sort of underlying part that we're not talking about, which is kind of fascinating. But when Sleeper passed away at a very young age, actually, he died at the age of only 56. In 1934, he died of leukemia. And as he had never married, Beauport and all of its collections passed to his brother. The house was heavily mortgaged. While he had had quite a family fortune, Beauport was an extremely expensive enterprise. And his brother already had a summer home of his own on Eastern Point, so he wasn't really needing to use that house for that purpose. And so because Sleeper was so immensely popular, the house was at risk of being broken up and sold off room by room. And the family pictured here is the McCann family. They purchased the house in 1936. Helena Woolworth McCann was heiress to the Woolworth retail fortune. And so the family already had several homes, including several summer houses. And so as a result of that, and also with advice from Henry Francis DuPont, who Nora is going to talk a little bit more about later, Helena McCann decided to leave the house almost entirely untouched. And that meant all of Sleeper's designs and arrangements of objects were preserved. When Helena passed away, her children knew that her intention had been to give Beauport to SPNEA. And even though their mother had not been able to set that in place before she passed away, they carried through that intent and that plan. So the house and its contents were donated to Historic New England, and has been open to the public for tours since 1942. And so we really owe the McCann family a great debt of gratitude for their protection of the Sleeper legacy, not just in not changing anything, but also in passing it along to Historic New England so we can share it with the public. So I'm going to pass it over to Nora.
Thanks, Kristen. That was very, very helpful. You give a wonderful introduction to Sleeper and Beauport, and how historic New England acquired this property, and to think that, yes, we've been around since 1910, but we've actually been sharing this property with the public since the 1940s. Um, but what we're going to do now is switch gears a bit and delve into Sleeper's influence on American decorative arts and design in the Progressive era and interwar years, and honestly, even the impact that his stunning summer home still has today on interior decorating, design, and collecting. And I think you'll see that long before we use this term influencer that we're all so accustomed to now, Sleeper and his close circle of really like minded individuals had such a significant impact on how we saw American history, American design, and what we would now call Americana, that we even continue to see their influence today. So today what we'll do is look at Sleeper as an antiquarian, a collector, an artist with really an incredible eye for color. Of course, one of the first professional interior decorators or designers, and honestly, arguably as an influencer long after his death. And what we'll do is we'll take this journey by looking closely at really the crown jewel of his work, which is Beauport, as well as a few of the works he did for clients and friends. So along the way, you will see how he turned a small summer cottage with just a few rooms into this 40 plus room labyrinth of color, collections, and panache. So let's start with the Beauport of the past. You already saw that wonderful photograph from Kristen as well, and the inspiration for Beauport. But this is a photograph of Beauport shortly after its first iteration was complete in about 1907, 1908. Here you see again that influence of the arts and crafts movement. It's styled as a Queen Anne's English country home. And of course, the arts and crafts movement in the United States, though different in many ways from its English counterpart, um, was very influential on historians and antiquarians and artists in the late 19th and early 20th century. With New England, and in particular Boston, being very central to this expansion of the arts and crafts movement from Great Britain to the United States. And in arguing for a return to things like visible construction, simpler design, and a slower way of living, many proponents of the arts and crafts movement were harkening back to imagined, simpler pasts. And though, whilst we don't know if Sleeper ever fully identified with the movement and all of its philosophies and rhetoric, it's very clear that its popularity and influence were part of what he did, and you can really still see them in his work today. So, where medieval influences looked to as kind of the impetus in British arts and crafts, also Gothic, they go hand in hand. For the United States, a far younger nation, they were really looking to the colonial era. And interestingly, Sleeper's development of Beauport rather, follows this trajectory. So the earliest rooms are really reflect this British and European influence. So you have places like the medieval hall, the Byron bedroom, the Nelson bedroom, the Strawberry Hill room, which is of course dedicated to the legacy of Horace Walpole. But then in his second phase of construction after World War I, Sleeper really begins to focus on American stories and American decorative arts. And he gives us places like the Pine Kitchen and the Franklin Game Room. And then later, as Kristen was saying, right, when he has really emerged as this professional interior designer in the later stages of completion of Beauport in the 20s and 30s, Sleeper really finds a balance between Americana and Europe and Asian influence, which is probably best seen through rooms like Octagon, China Trade, and Stair Hall. So, in an era when the United States was seeking to define a singular cultural identity, right, from the 1890s well into the 1940s, Sleeper's milieu began turning its attention to the nation's colonial past as a way to kind of figure out who the United States was going to be. Um, and as such, at this time, we really get the first wave of professional historic preservationists. We see the founding of historical societies and house museums on a far grander scale than we had before. And a new generation of antiquarians and art historians come forth to lead the cultural discourse. And that cultural discourse then permeates its way to culture at large, and you start to see the influence in everyday life. But what we're going to see is Sleeper's home and his style really evolved hand in hand with the world in this way. And ultimately, it influenced not just his generation, but those that followed. So before we really dig into the individual rooms in Beauport, not all 42 plus, we don't have time for that. I wish we did. Um, but I want to put Beauport, at least its first iteration, into context. So I want to look at some major moments in the fields of American antiquarianism, interior design, and collecting that were taking place at the same time that Beauport was being built and expanded. So, of course, there had been an interest and resurgence in the study of U.S. history, design, and architecture at times like the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and again in the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. But the shift that was taking place in these first few decades of the 20th century was more permanent. And it saw major history and art museums who had previously looked really only to Europe and parts of Asia as the areas that were worthwhile of study and the areas that could teach others good taste. And what it did is this is when the time where these institutions began to permanently present American decorative arts for the first time for serious study and as a way to train the public eye and public taste. So, less than 20 miles to the south of Beauport, in 1907, the Essex Institute in Peabody, Massachusetts, opened its first period rooms. These included rooms focusing on the 18th and 19th century and domestic design and architecture and goods in colonial and early America. And what they did is they blended the best known knowledge of historical accuracy of these spaces with like the tiniest bit of aesthetic cherry picking, um, and presented these spaces as the way that Americans used to live, and they became wildly popular. So much so that they became a whole new focus for many U.S. museums. And when I really want to think about the idea of a period room here in comparison with Sleeper. Um, when Sleeper passed in 1934, the magazine Antiques uh, really positioned Sleeper as what they said was he was primarily a creative artist and secondarily an antiquary. They considered him a person with the quality and care that who sought the quality and character of ancient things, yet was never really boxed in by the letter of period design. They said that he instead rifled the past to achieve new and often entrancing modern harmonies. And I think this sums up the difference that's happening here quite well. So while museums like the Essex Institute, Brooklyn Museums, and the Met are putting together these quote unquote historically accurate period rooms, again with that little pinch of theatricality, Sleeper is really starting with the eclectic and the theatrical composition. He's creating spaces with the spirit of a specific place or a person or a time period, and ending up with rooms that feel like they could be a period room, and it definitely have elements of that. They just don't have that goal of accuracy that the dedicated historians and art historians had. So jumping 2 years into the future, so 1909, this is when the Metropolitan Museum of Art they further cement the importance of American decorative arts and architecture within the canon of art history with their first dedicated American decorative arts exhibition. And that's the exhibition that was the predecessor to the American Wing we know today. Interestingly, much like the Centennial exhibitions and World's Fair, it was tied to a celebration as well, and that was the Hudson Fulton celebration. 1 year after that, 1910, we see the founding of two organizations that are central to kind of the world Sleeper was a part of, especially in New England, both his clients and ones that he took part in too. So you have the founding of the American Walpole Society, which is an exclusive club of scholars and collectors of American decorative arts, architecture, and history, which was founded in Boston. And membership included and still includes, it's still around today, scholars, antiquarians, authors, collectors, as well as library and museum professionals. And many clients and friends of Sleeper were members of the American Walpole Society, including H.F. DuPont. And of course, 1910 also saw the founding for the Society for the Preservation of New England oh goodness, you think I'd be able to say it? It's my own place. The Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, SPNEA, which was of course founded by William Sumner Appleton and is now known as Historic New England. The following year, 1911, while Sleeper was well into the creation and evolution of Beauport, he was actually appointed director of museums for SPNEA or SPNEA and remained director until 1913 when he left to help found the Shirley Eustace House Association, which some of you may be familiar with. So at this time, this is what's happening. This is Sleeper's world when Beauport is coming into being. Again, this is a photograph from about 1910, which shows the front entrance of the home. And we'll see it again later and see how vastly different it will be. But this is when we're getting those English-themed rooms. The first room we're going to start with digging into Beauport is the Strawberry Hill Room, of course named after the British romantic and antiquarian Horace Walpole's 18th century Gothic Revival house. The Strawberry Hill Room was completed in 1908, and it was actually used as Sleeper's bedroom. He noted that it was quite fitting to name it Strawberry Hill, as he said, quote, Strawberry Hill was the house which inspired so many details of Beauport. So here you see it in black and white. And then here you can really see, this is Sleeper, this color, right? This room highlights a classic Sleeper color combination. He was so skillful. You see these dark brown walls, the bright, almost golden maple furniture, hints of red. You also see some of his favorite textural combinations here that are in contrast with one another. You see these heavily patterned um, and textured fabrics that have very little shine compared to the high gloss of the wood, the lacquered wallpaper. um, on the right, you also see a really key element of Sleeper's design style, and that is that he paid very close attention to the transitions to adjacent rooms. So, what you're seeing through that green doorway is a room we'll come back to, the Belfry Chamber, but you're also getting that interplay between the dark reds and browns of Strawberry Hill, which is actually a much larger room than Belfry, but feels smaller with the color, and the light, bright greens of Belfry Chamber, which is a smaller room but feels very wide open. You'll hear me throughout this presentation talking about Sleeper's mastery of color. People in his day and today knew him for his composition of objects, but really, if you look at the field of interior designers and decorators at the time, there was also this love of his knowledge of color, and his use of color. Nancy McClellan, one of my personal heroes, and she was the first female president for the very first U.S. National Association of Interior Designers, which she helped found. She's an author, an expert on wallpaper, as well as European and American antiquities, and of course was a contemporary and friend of both Sleeper and William Sumner Appleton, right? Nancy was really one of the it designers, a leading designer in New York City, up there with like Elsie DeWolf, and she loved Beauport. And repeatedly, when speaking of Beauport, she always talked about how Sleeper had truly the keenest appreciation of color. And I think that's a great way to put it. And before we move on, I'll note one more thing about this room that honestly Strawberry Hill perfectly encapsulates. And that's Sleeper's penchant for playing with fact and fiction and history and myth. During his lifetime, an article that was actually written on the room claimed that the wallpaper was taken from the walls of Strawberry Hill. But in fact, we know that this wallpaper wasn't made until 1907, the year that Beauport begun. And in fact, the only thing in this room directly linked to Strawberry Hill is the catalog of the sale of the house's contents from 1842, gifted to him by A. Pied Andrew and sitting on the desk there. So again, you're constantly going to see this leaning into the in between. Is it fact? Is it fiction? Is it real? Is it made up? Is it fantasy? Is it historical? The next room we'll look at briefly is the hall, also known as the medieval hall, which was also completed in 1908. And again, here you see that connection to English history and the British arts and crafts movement. But as with the other rooms, it's far more fantasy than accurate period room. And unfortunately, we don't have a record of this room in color. However, you can still see in this the polished pink bricks on the floor that were in many of the first floor rooms at this time. And this woodwork, which was likely a very dark, rich brown. And again, you would have had that very typical Sleeper contrast between a deep, rich brown and a bright pink red. So this is the Jacobean Room, also known as Lineburg Parish. It was completed in 1912, and it really starts this transition from the English to an American focus. As we go forward, you'll notice that many of the rooms have multiple names that have been used throughout the years. Another name for this room is, as I said, Lineburg Parish, and that actually refers to a historic section of Ipswich, Massachusetts, where the woodwork is reputed to have come from. As with many other interior decorators and antiquarians of the day, Sleeper often used salvaged wood paneling, doors, windows, floors, and other bits from colonial homes and used them in sometimes exactly the way they were originally planned, like you can see here with the woodwork. Other times, a window may have originally been vertical and he put it on its side, or an interior door became an exterior door, and vice versa. This room is also a really great example of Sleeper's collecting methods. He never collected objects because of their rarity or their exceptional provenance. He really gathered objects that appealed to him personally, many of them that honestly had very little financial value at the time. For him, it was all about the aesthetics and the joy and the beauty of the collective or the whole instead of the individual object. Here in particular, the English and German pewter and the hutch against the wall kind of show that, right? You get these monochromatic displays of like one typology of decorative arts that turn into almost their own body of sculpture. I also want to point out before we move on the pair of figural andirons that are in this photo that still are in the room today. Here at Historic New England, we acknowledge the racist and harmful nature of many of the historical objects in our collection. These andirons, which were designed to represent enslaved persons from West Africa, are adorned with palm fronds or grass skirts and appear to have slave collars and manacles present as well. Having racist imagery was not uncommon among collectors and decorators and scholars in the early 20th century. Objects like this can be found in other rooms in Beauport as well as other historic New England sites. And in line with best practices among other institutions like the Smithsonian, we do not remove these objects, as that would be just another erasure. Instead, we use these objects to educate ourselves and visitors about the history that shaped our present day. So these objects are left, and yes, they are very often a hard history to face. And we do have visitors that are uncomfortable, but it is an important time during these tours to take a moment and dig into this a bit deeper. This is a more recent picture of Linebrook Parish. So behind us would be, behind us would be the fireplace with the andirons. This room was really used for close gatherings and dinners with friends. Again, it features these dark browns and golden yellows that would have glowed under the illuminated tin lights from the fireplace and by the fireplace. You'll also, we'll get to it in a second here, but there's also a secret door, which is very Sleeper. So if you're unfamiliar with Beauport, you still may have come across images of the Belfry Chamber. Originally completed in 1912, but so same time as the Jacobean room, but updated throughout the rest of his time at Beauport, Belfry Chamber is a favorite of guests and is often featured in contemporary design articles, blogs, and even pops up on places like Instagram and Pinterest quite regularly. And I think here you can probably see why. It's truly a spectacular room with a stunning color scheme that feels almost as if one is laying their head down to sleep in like this magical secret garden. And of course, it's accessed through a hidden door down in Linebrook Parish, up this curving set of stairs, and then you enter through that back green door. Um, and really, as you emerge into this room, you emerge into what is arguably one of Sleeper's most masterful decorative schemes. The wallpaper is Zuber's Decor Chinoise, which from the early 20th century was customarily used for formal dining rooms. Here, however, Sleepers use the paper, including cutting out additional floral elements to elongate the designs to make it feel as if the flowers are truly climbing up the gables of the room. A color palette of apple and celery green matched with his favorite maple furniture, as well as yellow painted furniture, and then outfitted with green glass, yellow tollware, and brass objects, really creates this striking, again, this really striking interplay between cool colors, warm colors, and the rooms that are going to be coming on either side. Moreover, what I really love is how he brings the florals down to the floor with this patterned hooked rug where the flowers are sitting on a brown background that's similarly colored to the floor. And it gives this effect of the flowers just being a natural part of the ground, right? So you're surrounded by this like wonderful, mysterious garden. Again, here you see that yellow glowing light and those golden touches, the yellow tollware On the right, another floral hooked rug with that same feeling, the brown background giving it this feeling as if the flowers are rising from the wood itself, and then the airiness of the windows and the white upholstered chairs. So now we're going to move on to the second and third phases of Beauport. This photograph from about 1923 really highlights those dramatic changes that took place over the course of 15 years. Here we have this enchanting, almost fairy tale cottage nestled along the water, almost more in line with the storybook houses of 1920s Los Angeles than the country houses of its origin. And in the second and third phases, Sleeper really does lean even more into the theatrical, truly turning the house into what Howard Mansfield so perfectly described as, quote, a dreamy house might have if it dreamed. So again, here's the front door. You saw the around 1910 photo earlier, and you can see just from this complete change in the way the entrance to the house feels. Perhaps second to Belfry Chamber, or maybe trying to trade, as we'll see earlier, or see later rather, is Sleeper's Pine Kitchen, and it also may be perhaps one of the best known rooms in Beauport. So this room was completed in 1917, the same year as the Franklin Game Room, another one of these American-inspired rooms. And I'm sorry we don't have time to see it on this virtual tour today, but you can definitely see it on a Nooks and Crannies tour at Beauport when we open up again next May. And I really think of these two rooms in, if we're thinking of our 2025 parlance, we might say that these two rooms were Sleeper's like Mr. Americana era rather. So here's a watercolor of the Pine Kitchen painted by the well-known interior artist William Rankin. In anticipation of a large article on the home for Country Life magazine, Sleeper had Rankin paint 8 Beauport rooms. He, of course, later used these paintings as examples of his work in his Boston offices. And now, actually, thanks to a generous donation from the John Mack Brown family, we can proudly say that Historic New England owns 7 of the 8 paintings. And I share this image not only for the importance of this publication moment for Sleeper and this professionalization, but this is also the closest that we can get to how the rooms looked when clients like H.F. DuPont and John Mack Brown, and then friends and visitors like Helen Hayes, Nancy McClellan, John D. Rockefeller, Louise Crowninshield DuPont, and Arthur M. Huntington would have seen and experienced the room. So the Pine Kitchen is arguably the most influential quote unquote American room from Beauport among collectors and scholars of this period. And again, we see strong color contrast between oranges, blues, and creams. However, as with the rest of the work, the Pine Kitchen, also known as the Pembroke Room, is a mixture of historic recreation and imaginative design. I specifically draw your eye to what is a somewhat odd looking pine, easy, or wing chair just to the right of that center table. This is a chair from imagination rather than history. And here we see Sleeper working it with his favorite local carpenter, Frederick Poole, to create a chair inspired by the 18th century, but somehow utterly modern and of the late 19 teens. The Pine Kitchen also functioned to highlight 2 of Sleeper's favorite objects to collect. I think he probably enjoyed these because of of course, their colorful quality, but also their connections to American history, and that would be historic glass and American redware. You can see how the Pine Kitchen, which is in fact the largest room of the home, also functioned as a theatrical stage. To the left, with that green glass window, you have this faux tap room. And earlier, when we saw in the black and white photo, the small table in the back, which is set up as if a family had just gotten up and left from the 18th century. Whereas in the next slide, you can see this is the main dining table that Sleeper and his friends actually used in the Pine Kitchen. And another sideboard or hutch filled with redware. And it's really this particular view, this section of Pine Kitchen, as well as what we saw around the hearth, that were so widely imitated by others. One of Sleeper's best-known clients, which we've mentioned earlier, was Henry Francis DuPont. DuPont first visited Beauport in 1910 with his older sister and fellow collector and antiquarian Louise Crowninshield DuPont. And from there, Sleeper and DuPont conversed and worked together as part of this core group of decorators and scholars that we've been discussing. One of Sleeper's largest commission was DuPont's Long Island summer home, Chestertown House. And here you see the living room, which really kind of reflects that Pine Kitchen Americana phase of Sleepers in the color schemes, the use of electrified tin and iron lighting, hooked rugs, and again, these monochromatic groupings of amassed objects. Later, when DuPont was creating what is perhaps the best known American house museum, Winterthur, in Winterthur, Delaware, he actually added his own pine kitchen, which you can see here. And it has seen various iterations as well. But I think if you think back to the slide we just saw with the table and the hutch, you can see the very distinct similarities. Again, this is just another iteration of that same pine kitchen at Winterthur. But so you see, of course, you see the similarities between these rooms, but I particularly like this image because it also highlights the differences in their approaches, which actually eventually kind of ended their professional collaboration. After his successful work at Chesterton House, DuPont approached Sleeper to work on the transformation of Winterthur. However, DuPont was more studious and concerned with authenticity, and that clashed with Sleeper's more eclectic, romantic relationship with both antiques and spaces. So you can see here, right, we saw that really imaginative, fanciful idea of an easy chair made out of pine at Sleeper's hearth, and here you see two actual 18th century wing chairs in their stead. The next room we'll be looking at to better understand Sleeper as a designer, collector, and influencer is the Golden Step Room, which was completed in 1921 and is named for the China trade ship in the photograph. And this is really one of those rooms that marks the transition to the third phase of Beauport and marks the transition to the time where Sleeper is fully fledged as a professional interior designer, and more of these rooms are becoming show spaces. So what you see here is kind of, again, that blend of the older styles of Beauport coming together with influences of European and Asian history. This room quite literally opens up to the sea, as the wall of window you see there with the diamonds can actually moves and opens directly to look at Gloucester Harbor. And so the seafoam green and white color palette, one of the few rooms with white walls, really almost blends into the sea. And then the bricks, which he'd used in other rooms, of course, which are pink bricks with a darker wax, they almost become reminiscent in texture and color to the cliffside and the rocks. So this room almost feels in that arts and crafts style where the outside is in, the inside is out. You start to see that here. And once again, right, this idea that objects were more than just their individual history. We have these collections and display of these monochromatic typological decorative arts in this room with his green majolica and green wedgwood, which have been quite inspirational to others, including quite famously Martha Stewart, who, like many contemporary influencers and decorators, has routinely been inspired by Beauport. I think it's quite obvious with her love of jadeite and the way she's displayed it over the years that she was influenced by a trip to Beauport. And perhaps best typifying the third phase of Beauport, although perhaps the Trinitary as well. But I really think Octagon, also completed in 21, gives us a great insight to this kind of last phase of Beauport as professional designer and Sleeper as professional designer rather, and Beauport as a expression of himself and his life, but also as a professional showroom. So the Octagon Room was dreamed up by Sleeper during World War One. Again, Kristen told us the wonderful history of him traveling to France, working for A. Pilot Andrew with the American Field Service, um, and it was during this time that the room really started to take place in his mind. You know, he wrote to Isabella Stewart Gardner saying that he already has everything imagined, and how perfect will it be to display his French ware, right? So this room was built in the shape of an octagon with a custom tiger maple table in the center, and it really does showcase his massive collection of red French toolware he acquired. But it also strikes this very clear narrative with the connections between Washington and Lafayette that you see in the room that speaks to the fraternity between France and the United States, both at the time of its creation, but also, of course, harkening back to the American Revolution. So this room, much like the comparison between Belfry Chamber and Strawberry Hill, there's that attention paid to the transition between the rooms. So Golden Step has a much darker, though no less impactful color scheme, following that sea green of the Golden Step. So once again, you know, he's highlighting this play between light and dark. I would even argue masculine and feminine. And so the transition between these two rooms is rather stark. You come into this space and you have these very, very dark aubergine walls. I know they look charcoal gray, but I promise you they are dark, dark purple. With this orange hued tiger maple and then this splash of crimson, right? Crimson shutters, lighting, toolware, prints, glass, and even Moroccan leather bound books. And of course, all of this is displayed in various groupings of 8, right? Reinforcing this octagon theme. And you know, this actually might be one of Sleeper's biggest and most strong punches of color. And I think in these pictures you can really see again that depth that Sleeper was able to achieve time and time again, and almost became a signature, right? So you see these dark, glossy purple walls, this bright, glossy tiger maple, and then the counterpoint of the matte red toolware and the red and white toile and the red and cream or red and white hooked rugs, right? So again, this stark contrast. Again, you know, this is kind of how Sleeper is and how he thinks and what becomes iconically Sleeper. And there's a similar color scheme here, though less dramatic, in the room of Chesterton House with the blue and the red. So our penultimate room on our journey through Beauport today isn't so much of a room per se as a passage, which is really at the nexus of the house. And that's the central hall. So the central hall had been in existence much earlier, but the version that we know today was actually one of the last areas completed by Sleeper and was finished in 1929. And this room, though quite physically dominated by this George Washington stove, once again really highlights that interplay between Americana and the exoticized Orientalism that were prominent in both the 18th and early 20th centuries. So actually, if you look closer over to the wallpaper by the door, you'll see a Chinese wallpaper featuring phoenix and Chinese figures. I will also mention that George Washington features throughout the home with his little Washington found over either very, very small or in this case, very, very large, featured throughout, more than 20 times throughout Beauport. However, I think probably the most iconic part of Stair Hall, and if you've been there, you definitely will remember, is Sleeper's glass window. So the window itself is a part of that architectural salvage coming from Connecticut, whereas the amber glass came from across the United States and possibly some in Europe. And this assemblage really is that perfect example of his use of emphasis on these dramatic arrangements of objects. Some of it which were, stunningly common objects, and others extremely rare and valuable, but all given the same attention as a singular body of art, not as a solely historical object. And though I think I keep saying this, this also might be one of the most pictured elements of Sleeper's Dreamlike House. And what makes this window particularly brilliant is that it's actually lit behind from an interior skylight. So the window is in the middle of the house, and to the edge of the house that this window would face, you'd actually have to go through a series of walls and rooms just to reach the exterior. So it's this brilliant engineering, right, that Kristen had touched upon. He would have a dream, and his close friends and collaborators would make it happen. So the last room that we'll be kind of virtually touring today is the China Trade Room. Again, this was previously the medieval hall that we saw earlier, but Sleeper transformed this room into this Orientalist fantasy after he acquired the truly spectacular hand-painted 18th century Chinese wallpaper that now covers the walls. So Sleeper's China Trade Room made use of two sections of this wallpaper that was believed to have once been purchased by Robert Morris, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but never used. Sleeper used one section of the paper for a client for the ballroom at the home of E. Bruce Merriman in Providence, Rhode Island. The rest was used to transform this really impressively large, tall room. For this space, Sleeper really leaned hard into this Orientalist theatrical fantasy, adding wooden rails to the musician gallery, filling the room with Chinese furniture and decorative arts, and even modifying a pagoda structure into an indoor chess pavilion. And this room might really seem to come out of left field when you're looking at the rest of the house, unless you just are thinking about theatricality. But I think it's important to remember that this is just shortly after the time where Gilded Age heiresses were importing and building entire Chinese tea rooms on their properties on both the East and West Coasts. So he's very much in line with the highest styles of the day, actually. And I apologize that this is slightly blurry. It's a very, very small photo. But this is actually the other section of wallpaper that Sleeper used for his client in the ballroom. And you can also see the similarities in the choices of the musicians gallery and the furnishings here as well. This is no longer in its entirety in Providence and now is at the Peabody Essex Museum. And of course, H.F. DuPont had his own Chinese-inspired room as well, but with a different set of 18th century hand-painted Chinese wallpaper. However, unlike Sleeper, and again, really underscoring their eventual difference in both goals and approaches, DuPont chose to fill the room with 18th century English and American furniture in the Chinese Chippendale style. And it was actually this style it's actually this style now that the Chinese Trade Room has become. And that's because Helena Woolworth McCann and her family, this is one of the really the only spaces that they transformed. As Kristen said, Helena was very good, close friends with DuPont. The two of them actually traveled across the world together collecting China trade porcelain. And DuPont, despite his differences with Sleeper, when the McCanns bought the house, he said, you can't change anything really. Like, to take away a few objects alone would fully alter forever what this beautiful thing Sleeper has made. He did, however, have one exception, and that was the China Trade Room. where he urged Helena to, in fact, turn it into something more reminiscent of Winter's Chinese parlor. And here she filled it with, again, Chinese Chippendale furniture. Um, and then also in some of the secretary bookcases, she put her parts of her collection of her China trade porcelain. You do still see a few elements of Sleeper in the room. Of course, the stunning wallpaper, some of the woodwork, and some of the ceramic figures on the mantle. But in general, the rest of the objects were either sold or given away. Although we do still have pieces of the pagoda. So, what can we say about Beauport and Sleeper in their place in the past and present? I would argue that Sleeper was more than one of the first professional interior designers. He was an artist whose mediums were interiors and decorative objects. His sense and love of color really made spaces come alive. Um, and while he never allowed his vision to be boxed in by the limits of the past, his study and knowledge of the history and the material world of the past changed the way that we thought about and still continue to think about domestic lives in colonial and early America. Whether he was looking at individual layers of paint on historic walls and attempting to recreate those colors, which he did, just to argue that, quote, so many people overlook the fact that once our ancestors had struggled out of their early hard life, they cheered up and slapped color on everything in reach, end quote. Or him amassing dozens of pieces of purple glass to display in a passage between rooms. As Paul Hollister put it so perfectly, Sleeper was, quote, a pioneer decorator, the trendsetter who showed that historic American interiors meant more than a historic spinning wheel by the big kitchen fireplace. End quote. As for Beauport, the home is still one of the most widely published houses of the 20th century. And just as it did when Sleeper showed it off to friends and guests and clients, Beauport continues to influence all who step through its doors today. And whereas his clients could take home a bit of Beauport by hiring him to decorate their own homes, today visitors can bring a bit of Beauport home with reproductions of wallpapers, furniture, and paint colors, and even pressed sandwich glass that are present in Beauport and still made by companies in the United States and Europe today. All that being said, every time at Beauport, I remember to take the time to stop and appreciate where I am, right? As a curator, sometimes I'm running in to fix a curtain and running back out. But when I can take the time to stop and really appreciate where I am, I often find myself thinking about how Howard Mansfield described the home. And I hope that you too feel this way if you've been to Beauport, or you will think of this if you come to Beauport in the future for those of you that haven't visited. So I'll leave you with Mansfield's description of Beauport. In some houses, each object is a tent stake driven into the ground. Each knick-knack holds the house and its inhabitants to the earth. Beauport is a boat upon the water. You would never set sail with such improbable cargo, and yet the place floats. So thank you so much. Kristen and I are happy to answer any and all questions. If you have any reason you want to get a hold of us, here are our emails, and we look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Kristen and Nora. That was truly a fascinating presentation, and actually just further proof that Boston is indeed the hub of the universe. Before we get to your questions, we have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On December 19th, I will be giving a lecture entitled London in the 20th Century, The Glitter and Glamour at the Heart of the Empire. On January 21st, our CEO, Ryan Woods, will talk with Rick Atkinson about the Revolution Trilogy, his series of books on the American Revolution. And finally, on May 20th, I will be presenting a lecture in person at Boston's Chilton Club entitled Murder Mysteries and the English Country House. You can find more information about these programs at americanancestors.org/events. We also have 2026 heritage tours that I'd like to highlight. In May, we'll be touring our wonderful home city of Boston. And I have to say, as an addendum here, we will be having an afternoon with champagne on the terrace at Beauport. In September, we'll be seeing the best country houses in Ireland. This tour is sold out, but you can put your name on the wait list if you're interested in joining us. And in December, we'll have a magical London Christmas tour. You can find more information about these tours and add your name to the interest list by going to americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we will answer as many as we can in the time we have. This one is going to be such a wonderful promotion for Historic New England. Does Historic New England have tours available of its properties in Boston?
Kristen, SVE, do you want to take this away? Take this one?
Oh yeah. Yes, we have tours available of all of our properties. Sadly, this time of year, not as many. We do have some houses that are open year round, such as the Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and also the Eustis Estate in Milton. Are both open during the winter months. But yes, go to our website and you can see all 38 of our properties, and then it will tell you when we expect to open. Most of our sites open June 1st for public tours. Some sites are able to do special tours over the winter. Other sites, unfortunately, like Beauport, have shut down completely, even to the extent of the water being off. So you'll have to wait till Memorial Day weekend.
We do. I will say, if you just can't wait, we do have many of our houses online have 360 digital tours where you can walk through the house via Matterport technology. It's not exactly the same thing. In fact, as a historian, and I say it's not the same thing, but it'll give you a taste of what you can see if you come in person.
Thank you both. This is not a question, but a comment from Maureen, who says she's very pleased that items like the andirons were not removed. We should not erase history. And as you said, it presents an educational opportunity. I think that's very nice to hear. Somebody wants to know who owns the 8th Rankin painting.
It is in private hands. We know where it is. We have a copy of it, but it is a family piece, and I don't think we'll be getting it anytime soon. But we do have a copy, so we know what it looks like, and we do have a copy displayed in the room.
Do you know who is in the portrait hanging above the octagon, above the fireplace in the octagon room?
Lafayette, I believe. Correct, Kristen?
Marquis de Lafayette.
Yep.
Thank you.
I was like, which portrait in which room, on which wall? There's a lot, but that one should be Lafayette. Yes.
We know a lot about most of the portraits at Beauport, but we know that one.
Yeah.
Does Red Roof still stand?
It does, in a very, very changed capacity, I'm sorry to say. And even up until not too long ago, it was still kind of what it had been during Pi and Andrew's time, but it is not anymore. I will say that the people who made massive changes to it did one favor to Beauport, and the section of the house that faces Beauport, where Sleeper would have seen from his bedroom and from his garden, they left that facade to look the same, so that it still has the same look from our side at least. But yeah, I'm sorry to say, Red Roof is not as it was.
Following up on almost the last bit, you talked about, did the McCann family keep any of the contents or objects when they left Beauport to historic New England?
Yes, probably.
I figured that might be the answer.
Yeah, I don't know specifics, but there was a lot. My understanding, and correct me if you know any different, Nora, but my understanding is that the period after Helena McCann's death, and even into the years that Historic New England owned and operated the house, that the McCann family kind of came and went almost as owners for quite some time. I know there were periods in that early stage where they came and stayed overnight, spent.
Yep.
So it was definitely still treated as a McCann family home for at least a decade or two after Historic New England took it over.
Yeah, so some changes have taken place after that time to, just move some furniture back, rooms that were used for bedrooms, things like that. But yes, I mean, it's a house filled with tens of thousands of objects. Kristen's very lucky. Out of her site, she has two of the most object-heavy houses. But with tens of thousands of objects, a piece or two might have made their way someplace else. But in general, they really did understand how important it was to Sleeper, to DuPont, and to their mother to preserve it as is. So much of it remains.
We have a lot of interest in objects in the house. Someone asked, do you know where the chandelier in the china room came from?
We get okay, that's we get this question very, very often. We don't know the exact maker. We know that the McCanns obviously placed it because you're talking. I'm sure you're asking about the clear one, not his little wooden ones with his faux flowers. Um, it's likely European. But again, we don't know. Just like the needlepoint rug could be a Tiffany rug, but the label's been removed. So it's hard to say. But that question comes up a lot.
And unfortunately, over the years, the statement that it's a Waterford crystal chandelier somehow made its way into the tour, and even tell the guides that we know now that it's not Waterford crystal. It still sort of somehow creeps in. So if you come to visit and somebody says it's a Waterford crystal, just forgive me.
I
Well,
can tell you that it's never fun when I have to ask my conservator to clean it.
You know,
Ginevra has very kindly put it up there on the screen for everybody if you haven't noticed it. Barbara has a very interesting question. Was Sleeper a gardener?
Oh, Kristen, definitely take this one.
so not that we really know of. I actually do a landscape design tour during the season. We do it once a month, and it's just a half-hour tour that we do in the middle of the day so that people can kind of learn about the landscape design and then either take a house tour before or after. So look out for that. It's usually the first Wednesday of the month. But the interesting thing is that when Historic New England did a whole kind of restoration of the landscape in 2011, 2012. And the problem with landscapes and gardens, as those of you who garden know, plants do not obey the way that historic do. You can't sort of set them at a place and time and then expect them to stay the same and look the same. Things grow and change all the time. And so when we did our restoration, we sort of hewed to a arts and crafts aesthetic, but we try not to have specific plants be locked in stone because you just can't be sure. And also we just don't know. We have some early pictures of the gardens when Sleeper was there, but we don't have anything that's really very consistent. So yeah, so it's an interesting question, but thematically we go with the arts and crafts sort of feel, and that steers us pretty well.
You will notice that you saw in some of those photos at one point it was the house was being choked by ivy, and that is one major change is the ivy no longer is attacking the house.
Carol has a perfect question. She says there's so many amazing rooms and objects. Do you guys have any favorites?
Oh gosh.
Asking us to choose between our children, but get that time, right, Nora?
Okay, hold on. Let me
Think about it.
One of my curator friends in England always answers these kinds of questions, which of course are impossible to answer, by saying, every day I have a different object, depending on the day you ask me, or a different house that I love. And I think it's something because you do have so many wonderful children that you love. You feel they're all wonderful, but this one speaks to me particularly today.
Yeah, I'm gonna say right now, if you were to tell me I could run in there and take anything, which I never ever would, um, but I would say there is a really amazing kind of ribbon stump work embroidered pillow um, in the South Gallery on a chair that is just, I've never seen anything like it as a textile, fashion, decorative arts person. It is one of my absolute favorite pieces out of all the houses.
Wow, I can't wait to see that in person.
Yeah.
Kristen, what about you?
I would say I'm thinking because objects, I have so many favorite objects in both my sites, and there are so many objects that I really think more about rooms at Beauport. And I would have to say it primarily depends on the time of day because
Hmm.
Mm,
the
I
golden
could see that.
setting over the water, it's just magical. But other spaces, the sun porch, which looks out on the terrace and the harbor, it doesn't have a whole lot of objects or furniture in it, but it's the color of it is this sort of aqua sea green, and it's just got this beautiful looking out over the water, and it feels very summer housey in a really
Yeah, good vibes.
casual way. Yeah, I mean, the sun porch is not a room that most people would say is their favorite, but I think probably that might be my favorite.
It's a good one.
Unfortunately, that's actually all the time we have for questions. I do want to tell both of you that we've had a number of people who have been typing in comments to say how much they love both of you, they know you, and how much they love going to Beauport. If you guys have any questions that you don't want to email directly to these lovely people, you can contact us directly at heritagetours@americanancestors.org. Thank you again for joining us today, and thank you both for your presentation. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and very much appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon again on our future online programs. Goodbye for now.